And it's my pleasure today to welcome Kara Walker and to have a conversation. We are planning to talk about maybe 45 minutes or so, and then we'll be able to take some questions from the floor. So, the first thing I wanted to talk to Kara about is how did she get involved in working with the silhouette, with the cutout, because that's become such an emblematic part of her work.
Hello. Hi.
Yeah.
How are you? Um, can we keep talking about me
Yep.
in the third person? I think that's easier, actually. How did she become? I at the moment it's a kind of a funny relationship I have with my name and lights. Um, I started this project getting well. I didn't get to cut paper silhouettes right away. Let's say. And I have many sorts of explanations for how this came about. But um, a little bit of background. I went to undergrad in Atlanta at the Atlanta College of Art, and as a younger student, I was painting, and I was trying to make these very large oil paintings that were kind of allegories of something kind of non-specific and sort of emotionally wrenching, but non-specific. And when I moved to Rhode Island, by the time I moved to Rhode Island for graduate school, I had kind of gone through a wave of interesting experiences, life experiences that led me to question my relationship with the kind of Western canon. um, and I think there was also a kind of a moment in the art world where people were talking, it was institutional critique and post-colonial critique, and I was sort of coming at those critiques from a very personal, um, from a personal journey. So it was a somewhat non-intellectual decision to abandon painting or reject the values that I sort of into imagined were part of painting. You know, that there was a very patriarchal universe that I was trying to sidle up to, and I wanted to explore that relationship, the relationship of a woman and a black woman in particular, and her kind of cozy collaborative um, um, desires relative to the Western canon. Um, it's a long answer. Um, part of this journey towards making the silhouette uh, after rejecting painting was to embrace drawing and to embrace a kind of quasi-research method whereby I went to museum libraries, university libraries up at Brown and RISD, and sort of I had this project of mining any source material, image material that would lead back to this black female construction. Um, and so uh, part of part of my interests spanned Black Arts Movement, Harlem Renaissance, things like that, but also early American art, which was in colonial art, which was interesting to me because of its relationship to Europe. A group of maybe slightly less trained artists and artisans who are trying to create a visual culture for a new idea, and I think I was trying to do the same. Um, and of course, among that work, there were the occasional silhouette profiles that I would run across, sometimes scenes, and I was kind of running several arguments at once, or several proposals. One was that there's a visual culture about self-definition, and that there's a kind of written culture, in literature that spoke about types of a type of truth telling, like what one might find in slaves' narratives, that sort of embraced maybe some fictional tropes at the same time. And I'm trying to describe this. There's a kind of a slew of information that I was either writing or cutting things out of, Xeroxing, and posting things all over the wall and making little drawings, but I couldn't kind of make the connection. It was like a bridge that was missing in this activity. And the silhouette, even though I was maybe making little drawings that were about the silhouette or were just silhouettes, it didn't really hit me until this moment of trying to bring things together. That what I really wanted to do was to sort of take all this information and kind of make it oh, make it solid, but also speak about it as not really the thing that I'm trying to define. Basically, what I'm talking about is like cutting out an idea and sort of removing it from this place that's chock full of information. So it was a cathartic kind of moment where maybe it was more meaningful to me and I couldn't describe it adequately, but to just cut it out led me into a journey of using the cut as my sort of mark, I guess.
The silhouette was something that became very prominent in 18th century France and then was very popular in the States in the early 19th century. It predates photography. It was a way for middle class people or people who couldn't afford to have a portrait made, at least to have a silhouette cut out. And it was a craft. It was something that seen as something that was amateur. It wasn't really art. Usually small in scale, intimate. Um, how did you? I mean, it really had a long history, a long tradition that I think, at least for me, when I first saw the work in '94, when Kara did actually the first silhouette cut out in the show, Gone, was shown at the Drawing Center in New York in 1994. And I happened to see that show. I was lucky enough to be in New York at the time and was astonished because this was silhouette unlike any silhouette I certainly had ever seen or was familiar with. Um, so could you talk here about that shift in scale and about the relationship of subject matter, I mean, to the tradition of silhouette?
Well, I'm going to take us back to that moment, cathartic, uh, back to the past. And um, so you mentioned a couple of things that yeah, I'm interested in those moments when the high art meets, sort of these displaced second-class forms of art making, and I suppose that's what I left out in that description is that I was also interested in sort of second-class art, art that was devalued somehow, and then in addition to my interest in the silhouette, I was also interested in the grand panorama, in particular. Well, Atlanta has a cyclorama, and I think there are just a few existing. This is a large painting in the round, and it was a popular 19th century entertainment. Um, and, Atlanta's scene is the Battle of Atlanta, and school children visit it pretty religiously. I don't know if they do still, but I imagine so. And that the cyclorama, I'm sorry, is interesting to me because it just took the idea of grand history painting to its end, and then something like film had to happen, I guess. This idea of bringing the viewer so close to reality, and yet you're still kind of having to deal with the fictionalizing of art making or picture making. Um, so, without being too calculating, actually, I think I was just automatically accustomed to working fairly large for my big paintings. And um, I actually started out I guess, in grad school with a series of just cut profiles. They were just done in wood, I think, and they were on a big wall. And it was kind of nice to sort of occupy a pretty big wall, not as big as the drawing center. Um, mm, the kind of impact, I guess, of having these big cutouts. Um, well, I don't know about the impact, but it's kind of interesting to create a little one-to-one relationship with something that should ordinarily be kind of secret and small. And then the subject matter um, came about, as a part of this investigation of what's really um, viewable, I guess. What's really, I don't know. You may have to ask me that again so I can find the right word. But it's like, what's the right thing to see? When I was looking at proper silhouette portraits, I was misinterpreting things when I was reading the text that I was reading. I was interested in the possibility of getting it wrong, or the problem of creating a relationship between the author and the heroine of a story, or the hero and the reader, is that the reader can sort of take over and muck things up. Um, so that's kind of the, I guess, instigating force for the types of situations, I guess.
In the subject matter, um, you are giving visual presence to things that were generally not brought into the public light. Um, is that fair?
trying to like wiggle my way out of this chair and out of this room.
The
I
spotlight's right here.
No, this is it. I How can we say this and be like serious, and like one of the interesting things for me, and that I do, and it works better in my work than in my personality, is to kind of you know move and oscillate sort of uncomfortably between that line of you know incredibly painful truth telling and the sort of giddy hysteria of just um, making stuff up, just to it's like a way of kind of regaining agency after unsettling a creating. There's one unsettling situation over here, destabilizing normalcy, and one way of sort of wresting control from that is to sort of laugh at it and sort of create a sort of giddy moment. And I guess it's interesting to do that in pictures because it's so uncomfortable to do it in life. So, um, but let's see, I have all kinds of stories I can tell. I don't know why.
Well, I'd love to catch a little bit there. One thing people don't remark upon too much is, I think, an amazing humor in the work, that you push things to often to a kind of absurdity, or a preposterousness, if you will, that for me sometimes I just have to kind of have a kind of little laugh, because otherwise might be too painful.
You know, Adrian Piper had this line in one of her pieces a long time ago. If someone can look and sound like me and still be black, who among you is safely white? And I had that in the back of my head as like a variation of that in these kinds of young adult years, I guess, young adult into early adulthood. After I learned of her work, that phrase kind of was recast in my mind as, if someone can, look and sound like me and, still be sort of Well, I don't have a like a real rephrasing of it, but I just found myself in these kinds of interesting situations where history, this history, this legacy of racism was not a, was not a, wasn't relegated to sorts of fictions, not just the grand, Gone with the Wind fictions, Mandingo fictions, but also the kind of um, the kind of romance that accompanies language um, when we talk about racism, when we talk about, abuses of power or something. Like sometimes, um, if I think I have to speak in examples. I think I'm actually more of a storyteller, unfortunately, and that's funny to me. um, um, Funny to me because of the resistance I would have to casting myself as the storyteller. But maybe I am. It occurred to me not too long ago, maybe last week, that prior to making this work, I remembered this incredible discomfort that um, rose in me after the revelation that Tawana Brawley had made it up. Right? Remember the Tawana Brawley incident? And there was, I remember it sort of in this vague way because so much of my sort of existence prior to that point was sort of predicated on not being your stereotypical black girl, whoever you are, who claim, might claim me. So, sort of about evading categorization or something, and which meant sort of being a little bland and, private. And I remember because of where I was in my life, what was going on in my life, this kind of interesting kind of schism, somewhere in between the thing that I thought I was and, like a fiction of my creating and a fiction of somebody else's creating. There was this kind of space that was ripe for, that like a story. There was something that needed to be told there, and I couldn't assign any language to it on my own. But the Tawana Brawley case and the fervor surrounding it, I think that there was it also coincided with a moment when black women's bodies were being spoken about or being claimed as these sites of as an emblem or as symbolic of sustained, systemic abuse. And I I found myself in one or two situations in Atlanta where a person would speak to me in a very accusing tone about, you know, where my body ought to be or what my body represented. And um, that that kind of became the negress, that there was a me and there was the negress, and um, and I think Tawana Brawley sort of what that situation, I don't know, it sort of represented something larger than larger than itself, and it spoke about this kind of this negress whose um, I don't know, whose needs or desires were the property of others.
People, I don't know if people are remember or familiar with the Tawana Brawley incident. Um, is that something people know or understand or no? Yes, she was a teenager in the suburbs north of New York, I believe, who was found supposedly, and she had been um, her body had been written on and with horrible racist comments, and I can't remember if she had been cut or bruised or physically abused, but it became this that and she said she had been basically abducted by these white youth who had, written all this horrible racist stuff all over her body and left her in this kind of trash bin, and became a cause celeb in New York, and she became this kind of poster child about racism, and she became was used by a number of black politicians for their own political ends, and then it was discovered that she had made it all up, and it was a really deeply unsettling incident about. I mean, first of all, why she would have done that. I mean, it's sort of basic.
Yeah. I think also, and it is funny to just remember this again, I guess because I was, listening to Al Sharpton in the news about something recently, but I, um, I think it conjured up so many different levels of things for me. One, sort of my lack of sort of, recognizing of myself as a black woman. Also, my kind of interest in the kind of fiction, that was created there, and the necessity of it. Like it wasn't that she didn't, you know, I don't know. I don't have an answer there, but it was an interesting kind of creation of a narrative, and I think it was after that point that I started looking at slaves' narratives a little bit and thinking about, how people choose to tell their stories and what gets left out. And there's something about what's not known, like what you said. Why did she do it? That's pretty much the unknown, and it doesn't really matter anymore because there's this overarching sort of fiction. It's about the lie that she told, and it never, the truth of her sort of negressity never, you know, it never really exists. It's always sort of a blank space. It's sort of a hollow um, in the cultural unconscious. So,
I mean, again, one of the things about your work is that it's so embedded in history, the history of racism, slavery. There are the first piece kind of conjures a romance novel of the antebellum South. Then there's the the end of Uncle Tom, which references Uncle Tom's Cabin, the pre-Civil War novel. I mean, there are lots and lots of references, even as you said, to the kind of American and primitive work coming in the 19th century, itinerants and craftsmen and so on. So there are lots and lots of historical references and linkages and references, but at the same time, the idea of contemporary society. I mean, you mentioned Darfur in your statement about your work. Could you? I mean, I think that the work is both. I think for me, it makes one realize that our contemporary society, our contemporary culture is so. I mean, we're not disconnected from those histories. You can't, you know.
we're not disconnected, but I think like one of the sort of um, slightly depressing and maybe the point where the work gets giddy is, you know, I kind of I think I'm a fantasy making creature. I'm a fictionalizing character just by having chosen to be an artist, instead of something maybe useful. um, but um, in choosing to be an artist, it sort of means, okay, well, I'm choosing to respond to this world that I live in through this fictional mode. So everything I do winds up becoming a lie or becoming sort of embroiled in storytelling and craftsmanship and different histories of types of mark making, feminist art movement and black arts movements and things like that. And then whatever it was, the historical source is sort of a part of that, but not necessarily the only element. But yeah, lately, and it's been asked so many times, why is the work sort of living in this 19th century landscape, and will you update your imagery and questions like that, and I think that I think some of my um, themes or some of my interests have been sort of gradually rolling through sort of different moments in history. Sort of, I think I'm up to the 30s. I'm actually I moved out of the silent era, moved into film. I haven't got to much further than that, but but I've addressed that question a little bit in some recent work. I think a lot of the typing and writing that I do that sometimes appears in a final piece has been about the kind of language that we use, or the kind of language that comes from um, perpetrators of injustice, and that's kind of universal. And I can refer to contemporary incidents through that kind of exercise, a kind of writing exercise.
I'd love to talk a little bit about the film work because, which is the more recent development. We have there are three film installations in the exhibition. I really encourage you to look at those. They're I think seamlessly interjoined with the drawing and the cutouts and the other work, both formally and in terms of subject. Each one is a little less than or a little more than 10 minutes. But I remarked on this the other day. It's in the films is where the imagery, in fact, is sort of the most gut wrenching, if you will. It's the last one in the video gallery, Eight Possible Endings, is Eight Possible Beginnings. Sorry, is I just it's so powerful in terms of its emotional impact, certainly on me. That the films have allowed something else to come out in the work. Can you talk about that?
I'm still trying to learn how to really do films, but right now it's still kind of an organic. Well, it's not organic. It's not that I don't have a plan, but I'm not a director. There's like the films come about in the way that an installation might come about. There's some sketching, a little bit of writing, some cobbling of things together, an initiating idea or image. I think I had it was the most complex time maybe working on Eight Possible Beginnings. This is 16 millimeter film with a crew of three. It's myself, a puppeteer, and a cameraman, cameraman slash editor, and it's very collaborative. So at some point we were all trying to figure out how to sort of make the best kinds of joints, to make the puppets articulate. I'm putting together these different characters and trying to figure out what they mean. But my initial impulse with that work was to make my own creation myth for Black America, based on the kind of creation stories that we tell about ourselves, but in a very sort of limited way. I just wanted to take the Middle Passage and it's like the Middle Passage through to the Jim Crow era and leave it at that, and just to sort of suggest, well, here's some possibilities how we can say this thing happened. You might have given me a good idea for the next one, Eight Possible Endings, but I'm not sure. And eight just being random because there was a time limit. Um, um, so I don't know. I could talk about it's a series of vignettes, some live action, and it did sort of grow outward. At some point there was the question, well, when do we get to number, three of the eight possible? And I said, well, it doesn't really matter at some point. You've got, a sort of middle passage scene, a kind of new world scene, the old world, new world, um, and then a few scenes that maybe get a little bit more complicated. There's a character that we started calling King Cotton, as we moved him around, and I knew that King Cotton was going to get pregnant, male character, and it's one of these moments when I'm working it maybe seems completely frivolous and extraneous and wrong, um, but I kind of understood it as recasting this black woman's body, the one that gets sort of claimed and owned by, you know, sort of righteous brothers and maybe unsuspecting, you know, sort of hungry white males, and there's this kind of I had a kind of sense of resisting telling the story of a black woman's rape. I think I felt accosted at times when people would tell me, about my history through an image of my body, this projected negress. So I wanted to just sort of throw that back and put the onus on this male figure. And I wanted to give him the opportunity to experience the trauma of childbirth, and also to create. I don't know if it comes through or not in the film, but I think he's a very tender little guy. I think he's jaunty and somewhat tender, and he has a sort of brief moment in the center of the film.
You also completed the most recent work in the exhibition is a 5-part projection piece that Karev completed for the Venice Biennale last summer. It's being shown then at the Whitney and now here. And I know you mentioned there are at least some of those images. There are references to Darfur. No?
Oh, no, I'm
No?
sorry. That
No?
when I mentioned Darfur, that was in reference to the most recent gallery show at
Oh, okay.
Sycamore Jenkins in New York,
Images there.
and there were images that had more to do with there were some small sort of cutouts that were called the Freedmen's Bureau, and just really taken from text lists of atrocities during the 1860s, 1868, in one small region. It was a very kind of tightly constructed little series of drawings, and then I had a series of written pieces, and I considered it's a kind of convoluted story, as they all are, but I wanted to make a painting, but I was sort of in the process of finishing my unfolding of painting, and there wasn't anything left but to write. So it was writing in the voice of the perpetrator who misconstrues himself as a victim. And I did 52 of these poster-sized cards, and sometimes they were just really riffing on the types of language that I was hearing in the news, and the sort of contemporary sort of interest in the trauma in places like Darfur and 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 on and on, particularly when it comes from this kind of distance.
I think
Um,
that was the idea of pushing furthest into our own contemporary
right,
moment. And of course, I
right.
mean, I have to say, if anyone saw the front page of the New York Times today, there's a terrifying, incredibly sad image of a village that's just been completely ravaged. So it's remains very contemporary.
And it's very real, and I think one of this comes back to that sad problem of choosing to be an artist, is relying on images, you know, like that, or other images that I've seen in the New York Times and other papers, relying on that to be my sort of source for reality, and the problem once again of getting to that, kind of that space where the thing is actually felt, that on the ground moment when the pain actually happens. So anyway, um, but relative to the video, um, that was an attempt to just make a very small, edible narrative. I wanted to sort of take, I think maybe the remainder of the King Cotton little bit of tenderness, and apply it to a younger to boy. I just had this boy in mind, and I created, this little, you know, he's a puppet, little maquette with a crutch, and was hobbling him around for a while, and was trying to figure out what was happening with him. And the interesting and maybe problematic thing with me and film and video is thinking about how to sort of structure the narrative. The narrative that I wanted to have was like a flashback within a flashback within a flashback within a flashback, to the point where there's no sort of stable ground. Um, um, but the main story is a boy, a maternal figure who may or may not be his mother, and this sort of master who may or may not be a master, and and it's just Oedipus basically, except that he gets it wrong.
Kara selected 5 films that are going to be screened here in the Wilder Theater in the month of April. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about some of your thoughts about choices on those films that are going to be shown here.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of really good films out there. I had was given some limits, and I decided not to be too kind of silly and program like 2001 or something, which I've done before. People are like, why did? Um, but let's see what's on the list. Yeah, I thought there's, Body and Soul by Oscar Michaud is a part of the program, which is kind of, it's kind of rough viewing, I guess. I'm not a film studies person, so my reading of it has, everything to do with my sort of level of kind of giddiness, and watching a film that what I sometimes wind up watching is the hiccups of the film. I'm so interested in the kind of earnestness of a storyteller trying to tell a story that's actually out of his means to do. um, um, and then within that, still getting the thrust of the story going. So you've got Paul Robeson, and he's a good guy, and he's a bad guy, and he's a gambler, and he's a priest, or preacher, not a priest. And it's silent, and there's film stock issues, and there's continuity issues, and overall, I picked that because that's like the aesthetic I'm working toward. Um, and there's a film called Tamango with Dorothy Dandridge in it, which is, um, I think, I think it was banned. Where was it banned? In France? Was it banned here? I would imagine it would have been banned here, but yeah, interracial romance, and it's not kind of kosher for the black, like she's involved with the captain, and then there's the slave revolt, and she turns tail, and it's just right up my alley. And Beloved, because I thought it got a bad rap. I saw Beloved with my cousin, who's also a good friend, and we got the last tickets in the theater on, we were sitting in the front row, up like that. But, we could just watch black people dressed up all day, we don't have to do anything else. 19th century garb, and so it seemed sort of fitting somehow. It was kind of an important book to read, and just visually, I think, very beautiful.
I want to ask one more question. I didn't ask Kara if this was going to be legit before we started, but I don't know if people are aware that Kara is a native of California, grew up in Stockton. Her father is an artist, abstract painter. figurative.
Figurative abstraction, yeah.
Yeah, and that it wasn't until Kara was 13 that she moved to Atlanta, and then was, in I think, a pretty different culture in the South. Um, and I wondered if you could maybe talk a little bit about, at the age of 13, that must have been fairly wrenching to move from Stockton, which, could you talk a little bit about what that meant, going from California to the South?
I think I talk about it all the time, still, unfortunately. I, well, I mean, there were two things that I still reflect on. One, my father was going for these interviews in Atlanta. We had been to visit, we had family in and around Atlanta. My father's from Georgia. So I think he was very interested, and he would sort of come back from his interviews talking about, well, it's a changed place. It's, Atlanta's really, it's really go-getting kind of place. And it didn't occur to me until really much later that it was kind of a way of saying, kind of confirming for himself and saying, well, it's much better than it used to be, something like that. And as a little kid and as a, sort of maybe young, and as a young adolescent in Stockton, I don't think I had a really clear idea of what he was talking about, but I started having dreams about what that might mean. Like a Klansman dreams. Klansman just shows up. They weren't harmful dreams, but it was kind of, they were like fearful, like, what? Oh, Klansman. And the other thing was that there was the Atlanta child murders. Atlanta child murders were current. And there was a murder, so serial killings of 12, 13, 14-year-old kids, boys and girls. I think there were a few girls. And my dad came back with a Save the Children button, so there was this kind of moment like, oh, just like a little trepidation. And the more I think about that, and these moments of, getting caught and, having to walk home from school when there's no sidewalks and it's dark and there's lots of overgrowth and, no, like, street lights, thinking, wow, it's really easy to kind of get lost in this place. And there were a lot of interesting high school moments of getting adjusted. It was like a cultural shift, language shift, and I think, I don't know how, I think this is true. Like, I think I had a different set of expectations imposed on me, in Northern California even, than in Georgia. It was just kind of like, well, are you going to read? It was like no expectation that I would do anything. Anybody would sort of do anything. Or
Georgia?
in Georgia,
Yeah.
yeah. But that's high school. I'm leaving out vast details.
Yeah.
No details for you today. It's just like creating a little opaque plane, just a little outline.
A silhouette, details to be filled in later.
Yeah. You do
So I think we've got maybe 10 minutes or maybe a little more we can take. So I'd like to open the floor to some questions. Hopefully you probably already had some questions, and maybe in the course of our discussion you've had some other questions come to mind. So do I see any raised hands? We have mics. I see back there in the yellow shirt, right there, Steve.
Hi, Carl. There's a moment in your pop-up book titled Freedom where you describe the Negress's journey from Africa to America, and you describe her body as one that's waiting for closure or amputation. I don't know if that reference is familiar to you, but there are a few moments in the show where there's one guy who has an amputated leg. It's the
Darkytown Rebellion.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Could you talk a bit more about the the reason or specific this why you described the Negress's body that way in the pop-up book, and what the figuration of that the male figure in the painting represents to your larger work.
Yeah, it seems it's a repeated motif, I guess, this kind of loss of limb, and it has, there's a kind of a reference out of slavery, of, the errant slave, the runaway who's caught, and one punishment, not uncommon, was to cut off the foot. A little like cutting off somebody's hand for stealing. Um, very, Old Testament somehow, and um, and then everything in my work, it's kind of like these bodies, these figures are sort of, they're vehicles for kind of psychosis, and um, I guess it's kind of, it's interesting to me that you read that pop-up book. Actually, I don't know. Nobody's ever asked me about that story. I don't think. Yeah, that idea that you have these narratives or these lives, these maybe these traumas that unfold and keep unfolding, and I guess my impulse is to kind of see what happens next, but it just kind of keeps expanding and expanding, and at some point you just kind of want it to stop, and will that stopping point be a violent, abrupt moment where something that came before it gets lost, or anything that comes after it gets lost, or will that be just a kind of neat summation? And I haven't arrived at the neat summation. I kind of always come to that, like, okay, not enough, like I can't take this anymore.
Question? Oh, okay, right here. Yeah.
Hi, Cara. A few years ago, I was at the Smithsonian at the National Gallery of Portraiture, and we were talking about Black artists. Or actually, the Smithsonian, had put this dialogue together. And Betty Saar's name came up, and then from Betty Saar, it came up that she was not happy with your work, etc. And I just wanted to hear what you would have to say about that.
I have a story that takes a slightly different turn. So how oh my God, I'm blanking on Elizabeth Catlett, and I were at a dinner at somebody's house in Atlanta, and we were introduced, and my family was there. There was several artists were there. William Pope L was there. It was like an interesting Radcliffe Bailey, weird mix of people, but great. And she was sitting at the head of the table, and she was talking to my mother about me. We had been introduced like 3 times. She's a lovely older woman, and she's a really important artist. And she was talking to my mom about me, and my mom was answering, and she says, "What does your daughter do? What's your daughter's name?" My mom says, "Kara Walker," and she says, "Oh, I don't like her work." And the whole table goes dead, silent. They're waiting for a response from me. And she turns, as Elizabeth Catlett turns to me, and she says, "Oh, you're Kara Walker?" I said, "Yeah." And she says, "Why do you do what you do?" Because I've worked, my whole life making, paying homage to women, to, women who work, and, putting a face, trying, just like making my work about these unseen, forces in our lives. And I said, "Well, I actually have a huge amount of respect for your work and what you do, and I wouldn't, have felt sort of free enough to do what I do if there weren't this, kind of, struggling group of African American artists and women before me, and hopefully after." And but it was interesting to me in my life to have set myself upon this weird path where I kept on experiencing things that ran counter to my expectations of, like being real and present and a legitimate citizen and human being. And I found that very interesting. That's kind of where that that Adrian Piper quote that I was messing up earlier comes back. It's like, if I can, if these things keep on happening to me and I'm still black, like, how can this be? So I just said, well, I just ran into stuff that completely set your work, back in a way that I didn't expect to have happen, and I wanted to kind of meet these worlds, to meet the kind of racism spoken and acted upon and recited and placed on my body, and come back and say yes, but in a very lyrical and expressive way. Um, this is, I mean, I just wanted to let her know that it was not a complete dismissal of um, her idea of honoring a black woman's body. It just incorporates a whole lot of shit. And then we got on famously after that. We were like, okay. No, I think I wrote her a postcard, and it wasn't, it maybe wasn't the most clear. I just wanted to break the ice, and she wrote me back, and it was really, really angry. Like, it was just like, don't give me your, psychobabble. And I thought, well, that's it for us, I guess. So, yeah. And it's a shame, really, because I didn't start doing, you know, I mean, I make the stuff that I make because it comes from this weird part of my being, okay? But I don't know that I set out to just have this kind of extended, I don't know, whatever it is. We could have a fight in a bar, maybe, and it would make more sense. It would be like real, you know? But right now, it's like she's answering to me and I'm answering to her, but we're never speaking to one another.
Okay, a couple. Now I'm seeing a lot of hands. Okay, let's start there with the white sweater right there, and then.
I would like to talk about the video room and perhaps about this gentleman's comment. There is one scene where an island becomes a monstrous, I don't know how to describe it, but then devours the authentic blacks, who then pass through the digestive tract and are excrement. And so I was just wondering, and perhaps I should think of it in light of your trip from Stockton to Atlanta. Does your work, which I respect greatly, but do you ever envision coming to something that's like a positive, new black female? I mean, that not that those are negative, but I mean, who becomes like the in the new world becomes the authentic, or is maybe I'm misunderstanding it totally.
Yeah, I don't know that I'm looking for authenticity, because it's so complicated. Like one person's more authentic than than another. I'm really in that instance, like, I don't know if I'm lampooning, but definitely pulling apart mythology using mythological techniques. I mean, just this idea of digestion, it kind of runs, digestion and reproduction, and the human body has been sort of the symbolic mechanism in so many creation mythologies, although I'm blanking on all of them at the moment. So it didn't seem out of, I mean, it was not out of keeping in my work, nor is it out of keeping in, really ancient stories, these ideas of excreting new life, and I think it's also not out of keeping with sort of Freudian psychoanalysis that, this shit is actually the first thing that we make, as infants. And, yeah, you're a sculptor up there, right? You're just like, it's like the first thing that you make, and then taboo is assigned afterward. And, I've used the shit motif over and over again just because, there's this very infantile part of me that's at work when I'm doing these things. It's almost self-referential, that I'm making, and I'm making gleefully, and it's all wrong. You're not supposed to play with it, and in Eight Possible Beginnings, it's not a pile of excrement. It's a pile that becomes a new man. It doesn't end there. He becomes a new man, and I think, in the whole the whole film is inconclusive. It has the end at the end, but it's not complete there. I think it's the end. Let's see. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but
I want to ask if
I wouldn't feel capable of doing that. All of the work is sort of dealing with sort of this watery ambivalence, towards the types of definitions that have been out there. Anytime something's imposed on my body, my sort of impulse should be to reject it out of hand and analyze it, but then the other impulse is to kind of embrace it and, go with the flow. So I'm always kind of here. It's like a hula dance.
Let me ask, there's a marvelous small early work called The New Negro. Could you talk about that title, that meaning? I think that maybe feeds a little bit into your question.
It's very small, cut out on sort of canvas, painted canvas. And there's a sort of, slave era dressed black woman, maybe, or looks like a black woman, kerchief and sort of a large skirt, not a hoop skirt, but sort of a ballooning skirt, and she's got this umbilical cord with a baby that's on the ground underneath her, as though she's sort of walking along in this sort of painless, or maybe it's not even a birth that's happened immediately, but perhaps she's just been walking along with this attachment that's sort of, living with her always. And, the New Negro, the term itself is more Harlem Renaissance era, this sort of moment. I guess it's the anthology that Alan Locke put together of the new creative spirit of American blacks. And it's a running motif, I guess, in the work is this problem of creation and self-definition, and I guess that piece is emblematic of it.
Here, can we get a microphone down here, Darren? Or Steve, sorry, I didn't know who's closer.
There we go. Oh, sorry.
Is it your intention for us to focus on the slave experience, on a period, or is it also part of your thinking for us to be as a elderly white woman who was raised up in the feminist movement? I take all the imagery that I see in your work, and I see it also in the context of gender relationships among white women, white men, black men, white women, of gender relationships, of how we experience ourselves in these relationships, both professional and personal, in the world. I experience your work as a jumping off place. I view it as historical and also contemporary. Mm-hmm. Is that your intention for us to have your work understood in the greater picture?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I hope so. I I mean, the sort of antebellum narrative, well, it's an interest over here, it's also a ploy, you know, it's like, this is what, it's kind of like in part of this awakening of my, maybe not even an awakening, part of my resistance to the sorts of narrow categories that are, say, prescribed for black creativity, sometimes from within the community, sometimes from the culture at large. I kind of embraced the whole sort of kit and caboodle of like black experience, real and imagined, you know, and that sort of location that's maybe easiest to come to, and yeah, that's easiest to come to is this antebellum South arena. We'll just say, okay, well, you know, it's because, you know, um, everything that was kind of relevant to my life happened within that fiction, and I think many things that are relevant to sort of a black creative voice happened within that system. And it's not to say that nothing happened in Africa, but I really wanted to narrow my focus to the new world, let's say. I've never felt comfortable in myself being a kind of you know, I was never really an essentialist, so I just thought I would stick to America because that's what I knew, and that's what I'll go with for now. And if I go to Africa, you know, then I'll learn something there. But this body of work is really about American mythologies um, and not just my place within it, but my place kind of creating it, using it. And really for the larger aim, I guess. I mean, I hope that it has sticking power and that it doesn't get kind of relegated to the realm of, you know, um, uh, this is the black experience. Nobody's ever asked that either. Well, no, that's not true. People have asked, you know, why is you know, King Cotton getting it on with the master, and that's partly because my cousin said, why don't you ever put the, my gay cousin's like, you know, I'd really like to see that, and 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 part, and also I think just my own kind of sense of I don't know, it's like there's something about setting up boundaries or looking at the boundaries that have been set up, you know, culturally, and then just sort of looking at where they can be crossed a little bit.
Right. Well, I was thinking, I mean, there's two different things. One, when you're talking about the kind of violations that happen in slavery, I'm thinking about there's not that much written about, like, for example, incidents in the life of a slave girl when she's talking about, you know, she's addressing white women in the North. You don't know the horrors that there have been. And then there's a moment where she does allude to pretty directly about even men are being violated by other men. So there's rape was not
But
just
everything's really an illusion in her.
yeah. So I mean,
text,
it's, you know,
which is-
that's like what doesn't get talked about. It's like,
Right.
so that I thought that that's what you were doing too, is just making a broader reference to different kinds of violations and who got violated. And it wasn't just black women, it was also black men. But then I was also wondering if you were just taking it in a kind of queer direction or just you know, like opening up that sphere.
I guess in a sort of non-political queer way, just kind of letting because I actually had I did have a question once from Larry Pittman, who was really annoyed that in the film Testimony, the sort of female character commits sodomy with a broom handle, and you know, he thought that there was something. He did mention something about, you know, the kind of pejorative, you know, implication there, and you know, the answer to that, of course, is that getting, you know, a broomstick up your ass isn't really like a love act, but you're writing this all down.
It's one of my academic papers.
Okay. But
We are recording this.
But yeah, it should be a question. It's one of those answers that they don't have at the ready right now. But I will work on it.
Okay, let's take one more question. I think you in the red sweater there, red
Hi.
dress.
Oh.
I saw your exhibit last night, and a friend of mine and I were having a discussion about the same piece, actually. And she was arguing that you're talking about emasculation of the black man in this piece. I was wondering, could you settle the debate? Is that something that you're talking about in that piece?
Well, it's kind of like recasting it instead of just saying, oh, yeah, it was there, but I tried to go around it by, and it's the same with Uncle Tom. Instead of suggesting that he was emasculated, I suggest that he's just feminized. It's this whole kind of castration complex, I guess. Like, is a man without a penis less a man, or is he more a woman? And what's so wrong with that? But I think because the character gives birth and then he kind of waters the little creature that is born, this cotton ball creature, and then it's not until later that you see lynchings. I just sort of wanted to change that expectation. Like I think there's something about setting up a scenario where the audience recognizes where we're going to go. Like, okay, now we're getting to the point where the black man's penis is cut off. I don't want to satisfy that wish. So, and I think that's true of a lot of the work, is to kind of set up, the expectation is that you all know your black history, and we're going to kind of arrive at that moment of trauma together, and then something else happens so that you're aware of the trauma and you're aware of the sort of the something else that happens, and it's that space in between. So you can keep arguing about it, but
Okay, I'll let her know. But also, I was wondering, because in your pieces I don't see very much like black male, white female relationships, at least from what I've seen so far. And I was wondering if that's also tied into this issue of feminization, or...
It's probably tied into the not meeting the expectations of the audience by just saying, oh, it's about that kind of fear of the... black male, white female miscegenation. I mean, that's sort of like the American, dream. It has been. I mean, it's been. It's like the source for the lynching of many men, many bodies. So,
With that, I'm going to call the afternoon to a close. But I hope this will initiate many conversations between people, both publicly and privately. There are a number of public programs that have been organized in conjunction with the exhibition. We are going to have a number of discussions here in the theater, conversations, talks. So I encourage you to continue the conversation and come back to the Hammer. And I hope this exhibition will lead to people thinking, questioning, looking harder at art and at who we are as a society. And I thank you all very much for coming out of this glorious California day into the Billy Wilder Theater. Thank you.